Okay, let's gonna start with this topic and with I would like to talk about what's the relation that has occurred during the last 2 centuries that relates the development of the evolutionary theory, the development of the evolutionary thought, no, as we admit now that we are a product of evolution, and also the relation that this evolutionary thought has with the fossil record, no? The human, with the hominin fossil record or with the human fossil record. Because sometimes there is a different, let's gonna see, say, a speed of admission of evolution that was not corresponding exactly with the fossil record because they are uh, two parallel ways, two parallel knowledge ways, but sometimes they have influenced each other mutually. Then let's gonna start with the first image concerning or starting the history, no? Because we're gonna be seeing a little bit of the history of the evolutionary thought, starting with this scientist. This scientist is, I'm sure that you know it, is Carl von Linné, or Carolus von Linné, or in the different language received different naming, but in fact he was a Sweden natural historian. He was studying natural history in a broad perspective, looking for geology, botany, zoology, and so on. No? Then all these disciplines that were studied together under this name of natural history. And the Carbonino that was living during the 18th century, in fact, he proposed a system of classification of the organisms that is still being used today. And that's because I start the history with Linneo. Because even that Linneo was previous to in fact, to the development of the evolutionary thought. Linneo didn't thought that the species and the organisms of the living or the earth were related by evolution. He proposed a system of classification basically using morphology. The animals that are more similar between them, I group in a genus. The genus that are more similar, I group in a family, and so on. No? Then he constructed what is called a hierarchic system of sets of organisms that includes other subsets smaller of organisms. Then this type of classification, the Linnean classification, is still being used today. That even that now we think that the relation between the organisms should be recognized not just looking to the similarities, but also looking to the evolutionary connection, to the evolutionary relationships, to the family relationships between the organisms. Then after Linneo, happens just going to the 19th century, it is starting to be or to appear the first scientist that relates the species using the evolution as the connection between them, as the fact that allows us to classify the organisms is because they have an ancestor that has transmitted the characteristics to the descendants, but this has changed through generations. Then, in fact, evolution is just that, change through time or change through generation. Then the first one who proposed in a more formal way the evolution to explain the differences between the organisms on the earth was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste de Monnet-Lamarck, or the Lamarck Knight. Anyway, the thought of Lamarck now today is a little bit dismissed because he thought, and I'm sure that you know about that, no? But I'm repeating things or remembering the things that you already know or you've seen a long time ago in the school. But Lamarck proposed a mechanism for explaining the evolution between the organisms using what is called the inheritance of acquired characters. What it means that he explained that during life the organism changes, and these changes that are produced by the behavior of the organism or the way of running, or the way of eating, or the way of they are living, their behaviors, produces changes in the organism. And he thought that these changes that are produced in the organism due to the changes that occur during life are transmitted to the next generation. Slightly, by a slight accumulation of changes through time, at the end we have a different organism from the ancestor of the animal that we have. That's what he thought that was the mechanism, and now we know that this is a valid mechanism to explain evolution. Anyway, even that the mechanism that he proposed to explain how the evolution occurs, we need to recognize that Lamarck was the first who proposed evolution to change. And this is a very radical hypothesis, or a very radical theory, because allow us to explain and allow us to connect the different animals through this, using this criteria, that is the evolution that connects the different animals from a common ancestor. We need to go to the next of these scientists that is quite important and still being crucial for understanding the evolutionary thought. That is, of course, Charles Robert Darwin. Charles Robert Darwin is a little younger of Lamarck. He lived during the 19th century. And I'm not going to be extending a lot about Charles Darwin, but paying attention mostly to what he thought in evolutionary terms, as evolution, to how influenced to the human evolution, or the human evolution thought. Charles Darwin was not the only one that found or proposed a new mechanism to explain evolution. In fact, the natural selection as a mechanism to explain evolution was proposed or was found together in parallel by another scientist that I'm also including here, that is Alfred Russel Wallace. Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, both of them reached the same conclusion to explain the mechanism that allows us to transmit the characteristics. The natural selection was also, it's a mechanism that is still valid today. Contrary to Lamarck, has now the evolution don't occur through the mechanism of Lamarck, but on the contrary, the natural selection theory, the natural selection mechanism is still valid today and allows us to explain how the species are related, how the species are connected. Just after the publication, the natural selection theory was in fact published together in a Linnean society. Well, it's not published, in fact, was released in public in the Linnean Society in an act that don't have a lot of repercussion, but in the 1858. But just 1 year later, Charles Robert Darwin published a book, the famous book of the origin of the species, by means of natural selection. And in fact, this book was released and was a complete work dedicated to the natural selection, because Wallace developed the natural selection theory in a very short paper, in just 10 pages. But Darwin was working on that theory from a long time ago, from decades ago. In fact, he started to work on the natural selection theory since he came back from the famous Beagle travel. Anyway, during many years, he was reluctant to publish the natural selection theory because he thought that this could have some implications that are against the ethics or against the religion that was present, and the impact that was present on the 19th century, and he was reluctant to publish. But when he received the manuscript of Wallace, he decided to make a formal, or to close the book and really publish it just very soon. But he didn't write this book in 1 year since the Linnean Society. He was working in this book since years before. Anyway, in this book that is concerns the natural selection that explains the evolution of a species, the only reference that appears to the humans is the sentence that I placed just on the top right of the slide. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. That's the only reference to man. What he tried, this book is basically looking for evidences that allows us to explain natural selection in wild animals, but also using domestic animals to demonstrate that also the artificial selection, because the domestic animals are passing through artificial selection, can explain or can be translated to the wild animals to understand that this has the same mechanism that occurs in artificial selection through domestication is what happens in animals that are not affected by domestication but are affected by natural selection. Okay, then this is the only sentence that appears in this book. Then there is no reference at all about human evolution. Just simple, was very enigmatic sentence and appears almost at the end of the book. And it was just saying that in the future I will, or we could study this topic, no, about what concerns or that's the implication of the natural selection to the humans. Taking into account that in the 1859, that is the time that the origin of the species was published, very few fossils exist. Very few human fossils exist. In fact, the fossils that appears were difficult to recognize. Okay, when Darwin published, I'm going to go back. When Darwin published the origin of the species, of course, everybody starts to, or the society starts to be scared about the implications that the origin of the species and the natural selection theory has for the origin of man. And of course, appears a lot of criticism that I just, I summarize in this cartoon, no, that represents Darwin with a ape body, no? Because everybody will aware about that, saying that the humans could be related or could be evolved, the closer species to the humans were the chimpanzees. Then many people rejected that vision, that the humans are connected with the rest of the organisms, and in particular with the primates, with the apes, and started a strong criticism. In fact, the theory of Darwin was not admitted at the beginning easily, because he received a lot of criticism from the ethical and religious point of view, but also from the scientific point of view. But even that he received a lot of criticism, some scientists defended and admitted the theory of evolution. And one of the most important scientists at this moment was Thomas Henry Huxley. Huxley, in fact, is familiar of the literature or the writers of the 20th century. He's an old ancestor, of this family. Thomas Henry Huxley was also a natural scientist, an English natural scientist, that also admitted that Darwin was right, and he thought that Darwin was right. Then, in fact, Darwin didn't mention the humans, didn't develop the idea about the implications of the evolution into the humans, but Huxley, on the contrary, was just 4 years after the publication of the origin of the species. He published a book that is called Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature. Then this is a book that in fact are like several essays, that is a compendium of essays that for the first time discussed about human evolution. Then in fact the first who started to discuss about human evolution was not Darwin, but it was Huxley. On 1863, there are very few fossils available at this time. These are images taken from this book, from the Man's Place in Nature. One of them is just tries to show the similitude that appears in the different skeletons of hominids. like chimpanzee, gorillas, orangutans, and gibbons, and he recognized that there is a close similitude to the humans. And he connect, even that he don't have the fossils evidence, he connected them in an evolutionary way with the humans. Even that they don't use a fossil record or the fossil record was scarce, I would like to mention that some fossils were found just at the beginning of the 19th century. The first fossils that is still being used in today, that corresponds to a Neanderthal, that now we know that corresponds to Neanderthals, came from Belgium, are the ones who are on the left bottom of the slide. They were found in the 1829, but they correspond to young individuals, to adolescents, and they are so close to the human that nobody noticed that they correspond to a different species. Going to the next slide, concerning the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals were discovered in the 1856. 1856 is just a moment, just a little bit before the books or the works of Darwin and Wallace. But even that they were known, these fossils of the Neanderthal that came in from Germany, they didn't use also these fossils to interpret as connections between the chimpanzees and the humans. Because in fact, at this moment, there was a discussion about if they really correspond to a different species, to a different fossil human species, or if even some people thought that they were corresponding to some pathological individual. In fact, I just extracted one sentence from the books of Huxley, even that he thought, and maybe it's strange now, no, from our actual perspective, it's strange that he thought that, but he says in this sentence, in no sense can the Neanderthal bones be regarded as the remain of a human being intermediate between men and apes. Then he didn't recognize that Neanderthals could represent this missing link, no? This concept of the connection, or this fossil that allows us to place together or to connect the men and the apes. He thought that this corresponds to a human, or they are basically human, but these fossils didn't wear the missing link that allows us to connect. Then the myth or the history of the search and the pursuit of the missing link. The missing link is a concept that, in fact, now also we don't use this type of concept, but the missing link was a concept was generated at the end of the 19th century that tries to deal with one problem. Chimpanzees and humans are quite different. It's very easy to see the differences between a chimpanzee or a gorilla, an orangutan, and the humans. Then at some point in the evolutionary tree, we need to find something that is in between both to be able to connect the chimpanzees and the humans. Then this is the concept of the missing link. Then the missing link, in fact, some other authors tries to propose it, to propose the finding of this missing link. Okay, one of the followers of Charles Darwin in England was Huxley, but also Darwin receives followers, or people who, yes, followers on German. And one biologist is particularly important because it's called Ernst Haeckel. And Ernst Haeckel also developed and placed and proposed to place the humans in what is called evolutionary tree. Of course, now we have the attitude, or it's very common to see evolutionary trees, but at the end of the 19th century, it's quite radical, or it was a revolutionary thought, to propose an evolutionary tree that connects the different species and the different organisms. Then, on the left tree, you can observe how he placed Homo sapiens together in connection with other primates. And in fact, he proposed some intermediate fossils that allows us to connect with Homo sapiens. These ones were not exactly fossils, but they were hypothetical missing links that connects the human with the rest of the primates. As you, I don't know if you can read it, but it appears like a Homo stupidus, no? And also the Pithecanthropus alalus. No? These two names are not based on fossil evidences, are just names that Haeckel proposed for this intermediate, for this missing link. Okay. At the same time that there are followers of Darwin, expanding, spreading his thought and the natural theory, natural selection theory, and also looking for the implication on the human evolution, in the proper human evolution. Also, Charles Darwin was also working on that. And in fact, there are some sketches and some drawings, as all the material from Darwin is preserved in a library. There is a sketch on the papers of Darwin that is dated from 1868. And in fact, here is the date of this sketch, where he was placing also the humans into the primates. I don't know if you can recognize the letter, but here it mentions the man, together with gorillas and chimpanzees, orangutans, ilobatids, and other ones. No? Macaca baboons, that's Xenopithecus, another fossil of primates, and the tree, this tree that represents the humans connected with the other primates, also are joined by the common ancestor of all the primates. And then that's the first sketch that was placed humans into the primates from Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, in fact, just some years after, he published a new book that had a major impact. That is The Descent of Man. This book was published in the 1871. And here he tried to develop and to apply the natural selection theory to the humans. Anyway, he didn't use, even that is quite strange with the actual perspective, he didn't use the evidences of the fossils or the scarce fossils that were available, the Neanderthal or the G's. He didn't recognize these as evidences of this human evolution. And in fact, what he tried is just to recognize how the diversity of the model humans has appeared, how the natural selection has generated the different populations of humans. That's basically the objective of the book, looking to the diversity of the existing humans and looking for the differences that appears in these different populations. Also, of course, he was also connecting and looking for the similitudes or similarities that have the males with the other primates. But he still has no what is called the missing link. He in fact talked about the missing link that wasn't existent at this moment. I'm going to be just reading one of the sentences that appears on the Darwin book, in this book, that is, nevertheless, the difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not a kind. Then he recognized that there is a lot of differences between a chimpanzee and a human, or a human and other animals. And one of them is concerning the intelligence and the cognitive capabilities that the humans have in comparison with other primates. Anyway, he recognized that this has evolved from a common ancestor. Then there is not, when he says that certainly is one of degree and not of a kind, is that he recognized that the chimpanzees are also intelligent. Then the humans have evolved more intelligence, but these don't deny the existence of cognitive capabilities, or evolved, or developed, or higher cognitive capabilities in other animals. Let's want to move. Okay, the Darwin theory during the end of the 19th century had a lot of criticism, in fact, because one of the major criticisms came from the recognition of the mechanism of inheritance, how the characters are transmitted, because natural selection implies that the characters are selected, are genes that mutate, and these are selected, And these characters that are selected because the individual who has these characters have success in survival and in reproduction, transmit these characters to the next generation. Then this, as Darwin cannot demonstrate which was the mechanism to transmit characters, the end of the 19th century is marked by a very strong criticism against that. But this criticism started to be reivindicated or stopped at the beginning of the 20th century with the development or with the rediscovery of the genetic laws that demonstrated how these characters are transmitted. Then the beginning of the 20th century is marked by the apparitions of a multitude of fossils, and in fact, Darwin would not work on these different fossils because it appears after the death of Darwin. But at the beginning of the 20th century is plenty of new discoveries of fossils. And in fact, the discoveries of fossils are parallel also to the development of the prehistory, of the prehistoric science. No? The multitude of sites that were digging provide fossils, human fossils, and during this epoch, this first half of the 20th century, was very common that when one fossil appears, it receives a name. Then it was not clear the connection between them, but it was at least recognizing that they were different. Then this moment of the history was a very confusing one, no? Because in fact, the fact that to give a name to almost each fossil makes us that nothing is understood, or it's difficult to understand what's the combination or the connection between all the fossils. And maybe here, this is not an exhaustive list, but you can recognize some of the names that were proposed during this epoch that later will be recovered, other ones has been rejected. For this moment of the history, I want to mention at least two of the major discoveries of this moment. That is the Eugène Dubois. Eugène Dubois was sorry, that's a mistake. That's not the last. That's not the last version because something has not happened. That's not the last version of my talk. I'm gonna be running because what happened is that there is a mistake. He is not from Aberdeen. He's a Belgium scientist. Then I'm gonna be skipping because that's a mistake. But I'm gonna be mention the discovery of the Pithecanthropus in Java, made by Eugène Dubois at the end, just in the last years of the 19th century, that he proposed as a name using the name proposed by Ernst Haeckel, and giving the name of Pithecanthropus erectus. Even that now we recognize the Pithecanthropus erectus as Homo erectus. Also, another fossil corresponds to the dart, the town child. The famous town child that was discovered in South Africa by Dart, by Raymond Dart. Anyway, all the names of the fossils found in the different sites, also the Homo erectus from Java, or the Australopithecus proposed by Dart, all of them received a lot of criticism from many scientists. And one of the scientists that was critical at this point was one anthropologist, one British anthropologist that is called Arthur Keith. Arthur Keith was a defensor of one fossil that now we know that is a hoax, that is the famous Piltdown fossil. Because he thought that the first hominins, or the missing link between a chimpanzee and a human, should be smart, should have a big brain. And the dart and the Homo erectus showed both of them a small brain capacity. The trinil brain capacity is even less than 1,000 cubic centimeters. And the town child corresponds to a young individual, but is reconstructed as the size of a chimpanzee. Then Arthur Keith thought that they were wrong, and that's because he placed the Australopithecus out of the evolutionary tree. In fact, this is a diagram proposed by Keith, and as you can observe here, this is where he placed the two Australopithecus, the position of the two Australopithecus. The Australopithecus following Keith, he placed it in the chimpanzee as ancestor of the chimpanzee, a fossil of chimpanzee or gorillas. But Dark, on the contrary, proposed that Australopithecus, Dark conception, is an ancestor of all the humans today. Okay, now you know the solution. No? That you know that the conclusion of that is that Keith was wrong and Dark was right. But this reivindication of the Australopithecus as ancestor of the humans was not accepted until the 50s, really after the second half of the 20th century, with discoveries from other sites, from South Africa, in Sterfontein, and so on. Let's go now. In fact, the myth of the 20th century is marked by what is called a synthetic theory of evolution. The synthetic theory of evolution, what joins is the disciplines, different information, different data that comes from different disciplines, that together allows us to reformulate the natural selection theory of Darwin. This synthetic theory of evolution allows to reduce all the amount of names that were used at the beginning of the 20th century were reduced radically. And because the natural selection and the genetics, what shows is that the steps of the evolution occurs through changes, through small changes of mutation through time. And this is a gradual accumulation of mutation, gradual accumulation of changes would produce the variation of new species. In fact, the neo-Darwinism affects a lot to the human evolution in the way of proposing that there is a lineage of connection, a line of connection that allows to explain how from a common ancestor between the chimpanzees and the humans, this has evolved and has changed until the evolution of the humans. This type of graph, or this type of graph, of course, has been reproduced thousands of times, millions of times. In fact, it's used also to make jokes and to make different types of things, also using women that don't appear in this schema. But this was this type of schema imposes on this time, because the synthetic theory what reduces is all the amount of names just to very few names. And in fact, the major impact on the evolutionary tree was like appears a new type of trees that were more linear, linear that are simple sequence of fossils from the oldest to the youngest, from the more primitive to the more evolved ones closer to the humans. And there are just very few proposals of some species that departed from the main evolutionary tree that goes from the Australopithecus to Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and Homo sapiens. In fact, this is related also with the multi-regionalism, or what is called the evolutionary regionalist hypothesis, that proposes that there is just a single species of Homo, inside the genus Homo, that evolved since Homo erectus to Homo sapiens. Then that's the situation at the mid of the 20th century. But after the mid of the 20th century, there are two major apportations to the evolutionary thought. One concerns first to the fact that not the species definition that is used in biology that conserves or that explains that a species is a set of individuals that can interbreed between them could not be applied to paleontology. On the contrary, the paleontologists define the species, the presence of the species, using morphology. Then really they can just study the morphology to identify the species. Then the differences, the morphological differences that are observed in the fossil record are the ones who are able to recognize the species, because we cannot test if they can interpret or not. Also, there is another change in not just in paleontology but also in biology that concerns the introduction of one school for study the evolutionary connections or the evolutionary, to reconstruct the evolutionary tree in species, actual species and fossil species. That is the cladistics. I don't have time to explain and to develop here the cladistics, and in fact, I hope that you came to my classes of human evolution to listen about what's the affection of cladistics, but cladistics focus on the identification of what are called the derived traits. Then just observing which derived traits are in a fossil allows us to recognize some different species. That's because the impact of cladistics affects the biology, the paleontology, and also the human evolution in the way of how to relate the species, how we recognize the shared derived traits in the different species, but also how we classify them. How, for instance, the name of hominins, it's derived from the application of cladistics to the human evolution, and so on. There are many other implications and influence of the cladistics into the paleontology studies. And the last major apportation of the evolutionary thought in the end of the 20th century is also the change proposed by some biologists and one paleontologist. Who was a paleontologist who was working on foraminifers. And they proposed that even that the synthetic theory of evolution explained that evolution occurs in a gradual step, he found that some fossil record demonstrate that there are some moments of evolutionary changes that occurs very quickly, that are alternate with other moments of stability. This is what is called punctuated equilibria theory, or saltationist theory, or different risks of evolutionary changes. Then with these two apportations, what happened is that since in the second half, if we go to the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, we're going to be seeing that again there is a multiplication of names and new species and new genus proposed in human evolution. Starting with a Homo habilis that was proposed in the 64, you can recognize in this long list that how the species that we are using, mostly on the present in paleoanthropology, are proposed in this last part of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st. Some of them are still using, other ones are not used a lot, or they are not admitted, and many of them are still in discussion. It's still a matter of discussion if they really are different species or not. But something important now that we have, because what is happening, maybe it's just we have a situation that resembles, that is similar to what happened at the beginning of the 20th century. We have a lot of names now in paleoanthropology. The same that happens at the beginning of the 20th century. But this multiplication of naming is not just a matter of one fossil, one name, that was the fact that occurs at the beginning of the 20th century. Here, what happens is that what we have is a consequence of the increasing of the fossil record, or the increase on the digging and the focus and the research and the project that has generated this amount of fossil evidences. The fossil evidence is so large and is so naming that in fact it's difficult to agree about how they are connected. And a part of the fossils or the new fossils that has been discovered, in fact, there are also recoveries from fossils or from names that were proposed at the beginning of the 20th century, but now are useful to recognize one part of the evolutionary tree, like the Homo heidelbergensis, that was a name proposed for a mandible found in Heidelberg, or Rhodesiensis for the broken heel cranium, or the genus Paranthropus that was used for some fossils from Swartkrans, from South Africa. These names were proposed older, but has been useful, and also because when you find a fossil and you assign to the same species that was found before, there is something that is called the priority in names. Then the name that was proposed before has priority over the name that has proposed after. It means that, going back to the previous slide, if someone proposed that the fossils from Georgia, from the fossil of Georgia, that here were attributed to a different species, Homo georgicus, someone proposes that are the same of Homo ergaster or Homo erectus, as Homo ergaster and Homo erectus names were proposed before, then you should reject the name of Homo erectus and take the name that was proposed previously. Then there is a priority in the naming. Also, a part of the fossils that has been recovered, also we have the fossils assigned and using genetic evidence, like the Denisovans. That in fact the Denisovans are a fossil or a population that was recognized first with the DNA, with ancient DNA. But very recently, just very few years ago, there is a cranium from China, the one who was proposed as Homo longi, that in fact now there are genetical evidences and proteomic evidences that assign the cranium of what is called Homo longi to the Denisovans. Then the name that has priority is Homo denisovianus, the denisoviensis. Let's go on. Okay, which is the actual situation? I'm going to be ending just a few minutes and I will conclude the talk. What's the situation of the fossils and the recognition of the fossil record? We have reached a different situation. We have changed the way of looking to the human evolution, or to the hominid evolution, or the hominin evolution. And in fact, now it's habitual to have this type of bushy trees or branched trees, trees with a lot of branches, with a lot of different compositions. This is one of the trees that was proposed just more than 20 years ago by Tattersall. Then, of course, in this tree, not all the species are present, or not all the names are present, because they were the names that were published at this moment. But we can start recognizing how the tree starts to be branched. It's not a linear evolution. And also, many times there are some questions or there are some connections between the species that starts to be uncertain, because the fossil record is incomplete, some of the fossils are broken, there are sometimes the anatomical record is not present to compare with fossils that have been found before. Then there are a lot of discussions about how to connect the multitude of namings that we have in human evolution. In fact, I'm going to be placing other type of trees, I have collected from other authors, other type of trees that, for instance, the one on the top that avoids to place lines and avoid the drawing lines between the different species, to avoid, in fact, the discussion between the different species, because not everybody agree about how the different genus and populations from the hominins are related. Or the one on the bottom that makes like groups, using the old species or the whole hominins, but also grouping the different species inside the hominins as the group of Australopithecus, the group of Homo, and the different species inside the genus Homo, and the group of Paranthropus. But also avoiding drawing really clear lines between many of them, because really there are doubts, discussion, there is no consensus about how it relates. Okay, anyway, to conclude that, what has changed, and we don't have any paleoanthropologist has a complete answer to about how to connect or how to generate the trees. But what everybody agrees is that the perspective of the evolutionary tree of the humans should be branched, should be with a lot of, it's a bushy tree, no? With a lot of branches, many of them that are not direct ancestors of Homo sapiens. They are side, can be called side branches, or hominins that extinct and don't have descendants, that don't have descendants. And Homo sapiens is the only species that survived on the present, but our past was very branched, and there is a very high diversity of hominins on the past. And even that we don't agree about how to connect, we agree about that the topology or the shape of the evolutionary tree of the humans has changed. And the linear evolution don't explain correctly how human evolution has occurred. And that's all for the talk.